So I finally got around to playing Tunic, a game which has developed a steady cult-like following as one of the most well-liked puzzle adventure games since its release in March 2022. Now, the game wasn't without some detractors, but overall it was an indie gem and somewhat of a critical darling. So now, when people talk about games like Outer Wilds, Fez and The Witness, it's not uncommon for Tunic to be mentioned alongside them, best enjoyed going into blind, which is high praise if you've played any of those games. But how does it play today? Now, I love these kinds of games. This genre that seems to be growing more each day. Games that make secrets their main selling point. And I especially love whenever someone describes them in that way of needing to go into them blind, a title that actually benefits from you knowing less about it. It shouldn't work, but so often it does. And it's an approach that has led to some of my most profound gaming experiences. Outer Wilds, Disco Elysium, and most recently Animal Well have all paid massive dividends from me knowing nothing about them before playing. So, having just finished Animal Well and looking for something to scratch that same itch, Tunic was where I set my sights. Unfortunately, I'm still itchy. Look, I really don't enjoy speaking negatively about a game like Tunic. It's not one of those games that's fun to dunk on, because it wasted your time or is just objectively shit. The love and dedication put into crafting this world is evident from the developers at Isometric Corp Games. So why don't we start there, specifically with the way the world looks and the general art design. For a humble indie, this game is stunning, and it just immediately impresses. The fixed isometric view, which is a personal favourite of mine, the forced perspectives that zoom in and out as you move around the world, and the bespoke angles that frame the action perfectly. I just love a game that has the balls to bring such a curated experience to its presentation the way Tunic does. It's also smooth and rounded. It sometimes looks like you're looking at a toy diorama. Depth of field is used really well. It gives the world this soft, dreamlike quality. The colour scheme is cozy. It's filled with lots of light pastels while still mixing in bolder colours so it's not totally washed out. It's bright, but not noisy, and it's always inviting. Yet there's also contrast to the more insidious environments that hint at malevolent forces with chromatic palettes and sinister splashes of purples and magentas. The lighting is fantastic and weirdly realistic for such a cutesy game, the way it reflects off water and dapples through trees. And the world isn't just pretty to look at, but interesting to engage with, an interconnected puzzle box that keeps leading back into itself in curious ways. Often, you'll go down a path to discover it takes you back to a previous area, and then you realise the path was actually there all along, and you could have exploited it from the get-go if only you were smart enough to do so, which I regularly was not. This is where it becomes apparent that the fixed camera angles aren't just a creative choice, but a design choice as well, often used to obscure these secret shortcuts in ways that force you to think outside the box. Although I found it lent on this gimmick a little too heavily, but we'll get to that later. Still, it was fun to explore this deeply layered world. It's deceptive in its size, and there's a great degree of verticality that makes the world feel much larger than it is, the illusion of scale on full display. Really, all the artistic choices made in Tunic ring true, and the soundtrack is no exception. Floaty, spaced out ambiences create an ethereal atmosphere that's reminiscent of games like Nier Automata and Stellar Blade, which it kind of goes against the kitschy art design in a really interesting way. Puzzle games are often frustrating, and it's important to have a soundtrack that works to offset this, which Tunic does well. It's futuristic and undulating tones, creating this calming background pulse. At times, it reminded me of Donkey Kong Country's underwater ambience, and at others, of Final Fantasy X's music in the Cloister of Trials, which is just about as complimentary as it gets. Now, while this all looks and sounds very nice, how the hell does it actually play? Tunic takes an increasingly popular option in recent game design, the hands-off approach. It's going through somewhat of a resurgence, although games from back in the day almost always took this route. Tutorials were rare and all the important info was relegated to the game's manual, which, crazily enough, was included with the game and was just a scant 20 or 30 pages. And it's this bygone relic that ends up being Tunic's most exciting conceit. I try not to spoil much by being too specific, but essentially Tunic has its own guide that exists in the game's world itself. It's very meta in the best kind of way, and throughout the world you'll find missing pages of the manual scattered about, and every time you obtain a new one, it will usually reveal some sort of important tidbit, like how to increase stats and tactics for bosses. The guide itself is just beautifully designed, invoking the same kind of craft and care that you'd find on the glossy pages of similar manuals you used to flick through as a kid. It's something I really miss about video games, and it was such a nostalgic treat. I always found myself perking up when I found a new page, anticipating what new morsel of information I'd uncover next. And when you achieve some sort of breakthrough because of this, it really did feel so good. It just didn't happen enough. Most of the time when I was stuck in the game, which admittedly was often, the guide didn't really offer the answers I hoped it would. Instead of missing some vital piece of information or clue, often I just couldn't work out where a hidden path was. In fact, that felt like the case most of the time. It was anticlimactic, it was frustrating, and it felt like the game's most reliable trick. This really bummed me out because it meant the guide felt wholly underutilized as the game's central novelty. Now, I'm prepared to admit that I am a complete fucking idiot. That is usually applicable. But in my defense, I have played several similar games which I haven't struggled with as much as this, or if I did, I still found myself having fun in the befuddlement, in the process of being perplexed. Games where the joy of discovery was still the central focus, but they also managed to nudge you just enough so that you felt somewhat oriented. I think there's a middle ground that you can find with these kinds of games, but Tunic is just totally disinterested in doing that. And while this is going to be the game's biggest selling point for so many players out there, it just didn't strike that balance well enough for me. None of this is helped by the fact that for a puzzle game, there just weren't that many puzzles. They're certainly there, but they're just not there in the abundance that had been sold to me, not in my initial 14-hour playthrough anyway. And those that are there didn't inspire enough of that wonder, you know. There weren't enough of those really great light bulb moments, those moments that make you just say, right, yeah, now I get it, now it clicks. The kind of stuff that's delightful but fiendish and really just makes you smile. The best puzzlers that I've played have all made me feel that way. They've all made me feel like a kid. And this just didn't. Now, I know that Tunic has deeper layers to it with different endings and undiscovered puzzles to enjoy once you've experienced that surface level. I did walk away feeling like I'd barely scratched the surface, but at the same time, Tunic didn't tease me enough the first time around to make me buy in fully to the deeper mysteries at play and actually want to uncover them once credits rolled for the first time. This means that I'm pretty sure I've walked away from the game without witnessing its greatest revelations, which is a shame because most of my time with the game was spent asking the question, is this it? Tunic's main inspiration is one it wears proudly on its green coloured sleeves, and I probably don't need to tell you what that inspiration is. It's pretty obvious. All the hallmarks of a Zelda game are right there. There's a Master Sword, a shield, cuttable bushes, and breakable pots, and, of course, chickens. You gotta have chickens. So much of this will feel familiar until the game deviates in one key area, the combat. Now, the developers made a choice, and that choice was to make the combat resemble a Souls game. Now, this is something that is either going to tickle you pink or make you say, Jesus fucking Christ, enough. Really? There's too much of this going on. Yeah, look, I normally fall into the former category. I love Souls games, and I know it's generated a lot of polarity, but I mostly love the way that so many games are adapting more of these systems. You know, they work for a reason, but we're now reaching a real saturation point where there's just so much of this seeping into so many genres that sometimes it finds itself creeping into games that just do not need it. This is one of those times. The biggest problem for me is that there just isn't enough depth to the mechanics to warrant this kind of approach. You can dodge, you can block, and your main attack consists of a 3-move combo, and that's pretty much it. But don't let the adorable aesthetic fool you. This game is hard, and you will probably still die a lot, which I wouldn't have minded if the combat wasn't so uninspiring. In most other Souls-like games, death is really a reward. It just means you get to engage with the combat again, continuing your pilgrimage towards mastery. Here though, death is just a punishment. The combat was not rewarding or interesting enough for me to feel compelled to conquer it. Tunic was a beautiful but frustrating slog for me. Its visuals are almost worth the price of admission alone. The soundtrack will soothe you as you bang your head against some of its thicker brick walls, and the guide is an innovative way to combat the game's opacity. But the decision to insert Souls-like mechanics that don't add anything, a shallow combat system, and a startling lack of thoughtful puzzles take the shine off. It certainly delivers on its hands-off approach, for better or worse, something that's always refreshing in this current climate, so it gets points for that, but it doesn't offer up enough satisfying answers to the many questions it asks of the player. So for this reason, I can't help but be disappointed by Tunic, a game whose peers do a much better job at selling their secrets.